The night she agreed to marry him, her hands were trembling, not because she loved him, but because she was running out of time. The hospital corridor smelled of disinfectant and despair, and every beep of the machines behind the closed door reminded her that money wasn't a luxury anymore, it was survival. She stared at the contract on her phone, the numbers bold and unforgiving, and swallowed the guilt rising in her chest. Marriage in exchange for security, a life-changing decision made in silence. She told herself she had no choice, that love was a privilege meant for people who weren't watching their world collapse piece by piece. Somewhere deep inside, she promised herself one thing: she would never let him know the truth. He, on the other hand, had been waiting for this moment far longer than she could imagine. When she finally said yes, relief washed over him, quiet, controlled, deeply emotional. He didn't smile, he didn't celebrate, he simply closed his eyes for a second, as if thanking fate for a mercy it had long denied him. Loving her had never been easy. It had been silent, patient, and unreturned for years. When she approached him with the proposal, her voice steady but her eyes full of something broken, he knew instantly why she was there. He could have refused, he should have, but love makes cowards brave, and brave men foolish. So he agreed, not because of the deal, but because marrying her meant protecting her, even if she never loved him back. The wedding was small, elegant, and painfully distant. Guests admired how composed the bride looked, how calm the groom stood beside her, unaware that two completely different hearts were beating beneath that perfect image. She stood at the altar feeling like an actress in someone else's life, rehearsing vows that tasted like lies. He stood there memorizing the way she looked in white, knowing this might be the only version of love he would ever be allowed: quiet, restrained, one-sided. When she said, "I do," she felt relief. When he said it, he felt devotion. After the ceremony, reality settled in like an uninvited guest. She moved into his house with a mental checklist of boundaries, rules, and emotional distance. This was a contract, not a fairy tale. She kept her gratitude controlled and her heart guarded. He gave her space, never asking for affection, never demanding more than she was willing to give. But every night, when the house grew quiet, he watched her from a distance with eyes full of emotions he never voiced: concern, admiration, and a love so deep it hurt to carry alone. She noticed the small things before she noticed the truth: the way he remembered her preferences without being told, the way he never questioned her expenses, the way he made sure she ate, slept, and rested without ever making it obvious. It unsettled her. Kindness without expectation felt dangerous. She reminded herself again and again why she was here: money, security, obligation. Love was not part of the deal. Yet, as days turned into weeks, the silence between them grew heavy with unspoken truths. She was living a lie to survive. He was living a dream that hurt to hold. And neither of them knew how long this fragile balance could last. Because secrets have a way of surfacing, and love, no matter how quietly it exists, always demands to be seen. Married life did not begin with romance or warmth. It began with distance, carefully disguised as respect. She treated the house like a temporary shelter, not a home, keeping her emotions locked behind polite smiles and formal conversations. Every morning she woke early, preparing herself mentally for the role she had agreed to play: a wife who owed gratitude, not affection. She paid attention to what she said, how she moved, how long her gaze lingered on him, afraid that any softness might blur the boundaries she had set to protect herself. Love was dangerous. Love asked questions she wasn't ready to answer. He noticed everything but said nothing. He learned her routines without intruding, adjusted his life around hers, and made space where silence was needed. He never entered her room without permission, never asked where she was going, never questioned her emotional distance. To the outside world, they looked like a perfectly balanced couple, calm, mature, understanding. But inside, he carried the quiet ache of loving someone who believed she had married him for survival, not for him. Every act of care he offered was measured, gentle, and unclaimed, because he knew the moment she felt indebted emotionally, she might pull away completely. Guilt became her constant companion. The more kindness he showed, the heavier it weighed on her chest. She had expected indifference, maybe even resentment, not patience, not understanding. When she saw him return late from work yet still ask if she had eaten, something twisted painfully inside her. She reminded herself again why this marriage existed. The money had saved her family. The deal had worked. That was supposed to be enough. But emotions don't follow contracts, and gratitude slowly began to masquerade as something more confusing, something she refused to name. At night, the house grew heavy with things unsaid. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the home he had built, a home that now included her, even if she didn't feel she belonged. She wondered if he ever regretted agreeing to this marriage, if he resented her for using him, or if he was simply indifferent. What she didn't know was that in another room, he lay awake too, fighting the urge to knock on her door, to tell her she didn't owe him anything, not gratitude, not affection, not explanations. Loving her, he had decided, meant letting her choose him freely, even if that choice never came. The first crack appeared quietly. One evening, she fell ill from exhaustion, collapsing in the kitchen before she could even call for help. Panic crossed his usually controlled face as he caught her before she hit the floor. He stayed by her side all night, monitoring her fever, whispering reassurances she never fully heard. When she woke the next morning to find him asleep in a chair beside her bed, worry etched into his expression, something inside her shifted. This wasn't obligation. This wasn't part of the deal. This was care, genuine, selfless, and deeply personal. As she watched him sleep, a realization unsettled her. She had married him to save herself, but he had married her to lose himself in loving her. The imbalance terrified her, because the more she saw his quiet sacrifices, the more she feared the truth she was running from, that money had brought her into this marriage, but something far more dangerous was beginning to keep her there. The days after her illness felt different, as if the house itself had shifted its breath. She noticed him in ways she never had before. The way he slowed his steps when walking beside her, how his voice softened when he asked if she needed anything, how he pretended not to watch her when she laughed at something small. The walls she had built so carefully began to show thin cracks, and through them seeped an unfamiliar warmth that unsettled her. She told herself it was only gratitude, only relief at being cared for when she had been vulnerable. But her heart reacted before her logic could intervene, beating faster whenever their paths crossed. He, too, sensed the change, though he treated it like fragile glass. He didn't reach for her hand, didn't claim the closeness that was slowly forming between them. Instead, he allowed moments to exist without labeling them, shared cups of tea in the quiet evenings, brief conversations that drifted from practical matters to memories of childhood, smiles that lingered a second longer than before. Every moment felt like borrowed time, precious and temporary. He feared that if he pushed even slightly, she would retreat back behind her defenses, and the fragile connection they were building would disappear. One evening, rain trapped them inside together, thunder echoing through the house like an unspoken confession. Power went out, plunging them into darkness lit only by candlelight. Sitting across from each other, stripped of distractions, she felt exposed in a way she hadn't anticipated. The shadows softened his features, and for the first time she allowed herself to wonder what kind of man he truly was, beyond the role of husband and provider. He spoke quietly about his work, his dreams of building something meaningful, of wanting a life that felt real, not transactional. She listened, realizing with a sharp ache that no one had ever spoken to her like this, with honesty that expected nothing in return. Her past began to rise to the surface, uninvited. She thought about the desperation that had driven her into this marriage, the fear of losing everything, the pride she had swallowed to survive. Looking at him now, she felt ashamed, not because she had married for money, but because she had assumed he was incapable of understanding her pain. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled as she admitted she had never planned to stay emotionally. He didn't interrupt, didn't defend himself. He simply listened, his expression gentle, as if her truth was not a betrayal, but a burden he was willing to carry. That night, something irrevocable shifted. When she reached for his hand, hesitant, uncertain, he didn't pull her closer or demand more. He just held it, steady and warm, grounding her in a way she hadn't felt in years. The touch was simple, but it shattered her resolve. She realized then that the danger wasn't falling in love with him, it was pretending she hadn't already begun. And as the storm outside faded into silence, she understood that the marriage she had entered as a transaction was slowly transforming into something neither of them could control anymore. By the time morning arrived, she knew the lie she was living had started to suffocate her. The way he looked at her now, careful, hopeful, unguarded, made the secret heavier with every passing hour. She watched him from across the breakfast table, realizing how naturally he fit into her life, how his presence had quietly become something she depended on. Guilt crept in, sharp and relentless, because the love growing inside her was built on a foundation he didn't fully understand. Every smile she returned felt dishonest, every moment of closeness shadowed by the truth she was too afraid to say out loud. The breaking point came unexpectedly. A conversation about the future, casual, unplanned, turned into something far more dangerous. He spoke about traveling together someday, about building a home that felt warm instead of impressive, about choosing her every day, even when life became difficult. Each word felt like a promise she hadn't earned. Her chest tightened as she realized how deeply he believed in them, while she had entered the marriage believing in nothing but survival. When he asked her, softly, what she wanted, silence filled the space between them like a confession. That night, she couldn't sleep. Memories replayed in painful clarity. The fear that had driven her to accept his proposal, the cold logic she'd used to justify it, the emotional distance she'd sworn to maintain. But things had changed. He had changed her, and loving him without honesty felt worse than never loving him at all. At dawn, with trembling resolve, she decided she would tell him everything. Even if it destroyed what they had built, she owed him at least the truth. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked under the weight of it. She confessed why she had agreed to marry him, how money had been her reason, how love had never been part of the plan. The words fell like shattered glass between them. She expected anger, heartbreak, rejection. Instead, he sat in stunned silence, pain flashing across his face in ways she would never forget. The man who had loved her so openly now looked as if something precious had been taken from him. Yet even in his hurt, he didn't raise his voice. He asked only one question: "Is that still the reason you're here?" And in that moment, she realized how far she had fallen. With tears streaming down her face, she told him the truth she had been afraid to admit. She didn't know when it happened, but she loved him now, not for security, not for comfort, for who he was. The room held its breath as he stood up and walked away, leaving her alone with the terrifying realization that honesty doesn't always bring relief. Sometimes it only opens the door to heartbreak. Days passed, but the silence felt louder than any argument could have been. He kept his distance, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation. The warmth that once filled the house had faded into something hollow and unfamiliar. She felt it in every empty chair, every untouched cup of coffee, every night she spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if honesty had cost her the one thing she never meant to lose. Loving him had been easy, living with the consequences of that love was not. He tried to understand, to untangle the pain from the truth she had given him. Part of him knew her confession took courage, yet another part couldn't ignore how deeply it wounded him. Every memory replayed differently now. The early days, her hesitation, the moments he thought were the beginning of love. Doubt crept in where certainty once lived. He questioned whether anything between them had ever been real, or if he had simply been the only one truly present. She, meanwhile, learned what it meant to love without reassurance. She stopped reaching for him because every attempt felt like a reminder of what she had done. Instead, she focused on becoming someone worthy of the love she now understood. Small gestures replaced grand promises, quiet apologies, patient space, unwavering respect for his hurt. She didn't ask him to forgive her. She only hoped he could see that her feelings were no longer borrowed or convenient, but deeply, painfully real. The turning point came quietly, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a simple moment of vulnerability. One evening, he found her sitting alone, sorting through documents she no longer needed, proof that the life she once clung to for survival no longer defined her choices. When he asked why she hadn't left, her answer was simple and devastating. "Because loving you is the first thing I chose without fear." The honesty in her voice broke something open inside him. He realized then that love is not always born pure. It can grow from broken beginnings, shaped by mistakes and courage alike. While the pain hadn't disappeared, neither had his feelings for her. He didn't promise forgiveness, he didn't say everything would be okay, but he stayed. And in that choice, imperfect, hesitant, human, hope quietly returned, fragile but alive. The days that followed were quieter, softer, filled with careful steps instead of assumptions. He didn't rush forgiveness, and she didn't rush hope. They learned each other again, not as strangers bound by a contract, but as two flawed people standing on equal ground. Conversations became honest in ways they had never been before. She spoke without hiding fear behind practicality, and he listened without expecting perfection. Slowly, the walls between them began to lower, not because the past was forgotten, but because it was finally understood. He realized that love doesn't lose its value just because it starts imperfectly. What mattered was where it chose to go. And she proved day by day that her love was no longer a transaction or survival instinct. It was sacrifice, patience, and presence. She stayed when it was hard. She chose him even when walking away would have been easier. That consistency healed what apologies alone never could. One evening, standing in the same place where their marriage once felt like a deal, he told her the truth he had been afraid to admit. "I loved you from the beginning, but now I trust you." The words shattered her into quiet tears, not of guilt this time, but of relief. For the first time, love wasn't borrowed or uneven. It belonged to both of them. They renewed their vows, not with wealth, not with pressure, but with choice. No witnesses but their shared past, no promises except honesty. She no longer needed money to feel safe. He no longer needed silent hope to feel loved. Together, they built something real, stronger than the reason they married, stronger than the pain that once threatened to end them. In the end, she married him for money. He married her for love, but they stayed because they both chose love, freely, deeply, and forever.